Chapter 10. A Tricky Intrusion. Although Louise and Jean were amazed and disappointed by Mrs. Carson's suggestion that they go home, the girls were too polite to argue the matter with her, but they could not disguise their glumness. Cousin Cynthia regarded them thoughtfully. Suddenly she smiled. Does solving these mysteries really mean so much to you that you're willing to take a chance on staying in New York? Yes, the girls answered simultaneously. Well, then I guess I'll have to change my mind, their cousin said. But I'm going to keep right on worrying about you. As often as I can do it, I'll stay with you. At the moment, the telephone rang. Please answer it, Louise, said her cousin. You're closest. Louise picked up the receiver. Hello? There was a momentary pause before the caller answered. Then a woman said, Who's this? One of the Dana girls? This is Louise. She thought the voice was the Wax Queen's, but it was so strained that she could not be sure. I'm in dreadful trouble, the woman exclaimed. Please come down to my shop right away. Who's this? Louise asked. Don't you know me? I'm the Wax Queen, of course. I want to be sure, Louise said. Give me some sign of your identity. Why, what I want to talk to you about is Victoria. She's still missing. Louise did not want to sound cool if it really was the Wax Queen, but she thought that this might be a hoax to lead the Danas into a trap. Tell me something else, she requested. Louise, what has happened? The caller asked. I'm the Wax Queen. Don't you remember I made a bust of you? I guess that's enough proof, Louise replied. They'll be right down. Oh, thank you, the Wax Queen said. Get here as quickly as you can. Louise hung up and relayed the message to her sister and cousin. In the excitement, supper was forgotten. Mrs. Carson and the girls put on their coats, hurried downstairs, and hailed a taxi. When they reached the shop, it was dark. Oh, I hope nothing has happened to the Wax Queen, Jean said fearfully. She rang the bell. When no one answered, she rang a second time. Mrs. Carson looked worried. Maybe the Queen is lying in there, hurt. She began to pound on the door. There was no answer. Try the bell to the Queen's apartment, Louise suggested. They stepped to the nearby door and both rang and knocked. Still no answer. Jean said, Let's call the police and... She stopped short and pointed down the street. There she is. Sorry to keep you waiting, the sculptress said as she hurried up to them. I've no phone, so I had to go outside to call you. Then I thought of a few errands I had to do. She tapped a large grocery bag she was carrying. Let's go inside. She unlocked the shop door, then flicked the wall switch. As they followed her, the sculptress suddenly gave a cry of dismay. What's the matter? Jean asked. With a trembling finger, the Queen pointed to an empty section of a shelf. 2 pieces are missing, she cried out. Somebody has stolen them. What was taken? Louise asked. Something that could tie in with the Queen Victoria theft? 2 busts are gone. One of Napoleon Bonaparte and the other of Marie Antoinette. All 3 of the missing statues are of famous people, Louise reminded the sculptress. Maybe the thief intends to sell them to a wax museum. Very likely, the Queen conceded, but there are hundreds of museums all around the world. I doubt if a person would be foolish enough to dispose of them in this country. Nevertheless, Jean said, the places can be checked, even if it takes a long time. Mrs. Carson spoke up. The first thing to do is to have the locks on your outside doors changed. I suppose so, the Queen said. There's a locksmith down the street who stays open late. Would you girls run down and see if he could take care of it right away? The locksmith worked quickly, but by the time the job was done, the Danas and their cousin were starved. Mrs. Carson suggested that the Queen join them at a nearby Chinese restaurant. We can talk over your trouble while we eat. The Queen agreed. First, I must take the groceries up to the apartment. I'll do it, Louise offered. Then we can stop by the police station and notify them of the thefts. A frightened expression spread over the woman's face. I can't do that. But you must, Jean burst out. Surely you want to recover the pieces. Besides, you can't keep quiet about Queen Victoria any longer. If you don't tell, Louise said gently, we will have to. When she heard this, the Queen seemed to lose all her strength. She dropped into a chair and covered her face in her hands. She began to sob. "Please don't cry," Louise said, putting an arm around the woman's shoulder. "I can't help it," the sculptress replied. "The police are the last people in the world I want to see." "Please tell us why," Louise begged. Because, the Queen answered, "I'm likely to be arrested any minute." Her listeners were shocked. The sculptress took her hands from her tear-stained face and added, "Someone has accused me of stealing the Victoria bust." "Who?" Mrs. Carson asked. "I don't know. Late this afternoon, I received an anonymous letter. All it said was that the writer was tipping off the police I was the thief." The Queen opened her handbag and brought out a typewritten note, which she gave them to read. "I'm innocent," the woman went on. "But who would believe me? Only the recovery of the statue will exonerate me now. That is why I called you down here to help. I would do anything to get that statue back." Suddenly, Louise's eyes flashed. "Of course you would!" she exclaimed. "And that tells us who stole the bust and why." The Queen and Cousin Cynthia were thunderstruck, but Jean was grinning. "See if I'm with you, sis." She turned to the sculptress. "The note's probably from your brother. He figures that when you're in trouble with the police, he'll offer to produce the statue, providing you sell him your business at his price." "Of course," said Cousin Cynthia. "That must be it, unless," she said to the Queen, "you have other enemies?" The woman shook her head. "No, the girls are right, I think." The Danas urged her to go to the police and tell them the whole story, but the trembling woman begged for a little more time to get up her courage. Louise frowned. "You ought to go to them before they come for you," she said. "Perhaps after supper," Cousin Cynthia said kindly. She insisted that the Queen wash her face, put some powder on her nose, and come along to the restaurant. After Mrs. Carson had gone upstairs with her, Louise said, "I feel sure the Queen is innocent." "I agree," Jean replied, "but is it still possible that she's a marvelous actress playing an elaborate cover-up game?" "No," said Louise. "She won't write a note accusing herself. That's going too far." A few minutes later, the foursome walked the short distance to the Chinese restaurant. They'd hardly given their order when the restaurant owner hastened up to them with a narrow wooden box in his hand. "You're the wax queen?" he asked the sculptress. When she nodded, he handed her the box. It was tied with a string. "I was asked to give this to you." He hurried off. Mystified, the sculptress started to open the string. Suddenly, Louise grabbed her arm. "Don't do that!" she exclaimed. "There may be something dangerous inside." End of chapter 10.